Hi, my name is Doug Marks. I'm an attorney with Worldwide Privacy Consultants, and today I'm going to be answering the question, does the California Consumer Privacy Act apply to my business? The CCPA doesn't apply to nonprofits, but it will apply to businesses. And most of you, if you're listening to this, you're probably a business. It applies to businesses doing business in the state of California or who process the personal information of California residents. And I usually assume that's going to be the case with my clients, or they wouldn't be asking these questions. So I'm assuming that's true for you too, if you're listening. So those have to be true, and then one of the following prongs needs to apply. So the first prong would be $25 million in annual gross revenues. Does your company have that level of gross revenues? If it does, then you're covered by the CCPA. The second prong is, do you annually buy, sell, share, or receive personal information from 50,000 consumers, households, or devices in California? And the definition of personal information under the CCPA is very broad. So it's going to include the cookies that you track, pretty much anything you can think of that you could identify to a specific user is going to be covered under that number. And then finally, the third prong is 50% of their annual revenue comes from sale of personal information. So that doesn't apply as much as it used to. My clients aren't doing much sales of personal information usually. They're usually collecting it and using it for their own business purposes. But in some cases, they do share personal information, and we'll discuss that a little bit later, but sharing personal information can be the same as selling that personal information in certain circumstances. So let's drill down a little bit on those three requirements. The first one is the $25 million gross revenue requirement. And the question I always get right out of the box when I mention $25 million, the first question is, well, does that mean just from the state of California, or is it from wherever we exist, wherever our company operates? And there are some complications about affiliates and things like that, but in most cases, that's not applying to startups or smaller to mid-size companies. But the $25 million gross revenue requirement does apply company-wide. So wherever that revenue is coming from, it's going to count. The Attorney General for the state of California clarified recently that the intent of this requirement is so that they capture a certain size of company, not necessarily that it's doing that much business in California. So it'll apply from wherever those revenues come. Okay, moving to the next prong. The question that clients usually have is, all right, I understand the 50,000 requirement, but what kinds of data count towards that 50,000 number? And my answer is pretty much always the same. It's pretty much anything. If you can identify some information about an individual, then you better count that towards your 50,000. So that's going to include their name, their address, IP address, email address, pretty much anything you've got about them. One of the questions that people have is, well, what about cookies and the data that I get that way? And my answer is yes, you got to count that as well. So just very broad, and it's better to be safe than sorry in this regard. Okay, moving on to the 50% of revenue from the sale of personal information requirement. So this applies if your company, your business receives 50% or more of its revenue from the sale of personal information. So this isn't going to apply to most retail operations. If you're running your regular business, you're not going to get 50% of your revenue from the sale of personal information. But in a lot of cases, a company will start out with a great idea and they're going to sell some product or service, and they realize, it's happened a couple times to my clients, that the real value of what they're generating is, at least a lot of the value is the information. And there are people who want to buy it. So you need to be aware of that. So if you're going to sell the personal information, then if more than 50% of your company's revenue comes from that sale, then you're going to be covered by the CCPA. And some things can constitute a sale under the CCPA that you wouldn't necessarily expect. One of the things that tends to trap people up is they might be participating in a co-op where they're sharing information for targeting purposes, marketing purposes. And that one tends to be hidden sometimes. It comes up as we're going through the interview process to figure out where this data is coming from. So just be aware of that. Quite often when I work through these questions with clients, they'll find out that they're not covered by the CCPA. So they don't have to get compliant. But in many cases, if they're even close and they're anticipating growth, maybe they're not meeting any of the thresholds, but they're getting close, then it's probably a good idea to go ahead and get compliant. What they find is that having the links and the web form and the terms in your privacy policy that address California Consumer Privacy Act compliance brings them a lot of credibility with potential clients and business partners. It's a lot easier to say, yeah, I am compliant, in response to those questions. Hey, have you dealt with the CCPA? It's easier to say, yes, I am compliant, than to try to make a legal argument that says why you don't have to be compliant. Another reason that some clients go ahead and get compliant, even if they're not required to, is that it's not as bad as some people make it sound. Some of these videos you watch, people describing the damages or the penalties that you can be subjected to, really overstate the risk. Another reason clients are likely to go ahead and comply with CCPA is that it's not as expensive as they anticipated. They can make some changes to their privacy policy. Which requires them, it does require some work. They've got to go in and figure out where their data is coming from and how they're managing it. But they also find that once they make the changes to the privacy policy, add in their link on the homepage, put up their web form, an 800 number, get some information to their employees about how to respond to requests under the CCPA, it's just not as bad as they anticipated, especially if they've already gone through a SOC 2 process or, they've already worked through the security issues. So that's one reason that a lot of people will go ahead and get compliant even if they don't have to. One last note before I sign off. I worry sometimes I see videos and read things on blogs that really make people worry about the costs of non-compliance. And sometimes those worries are a little bit overblown. I do agree that, there's a $2,500 penalty or a $7,500 penalty per violation if it's intentional. And those definitely are significant. But there's also a requirement that the Attorney General give you notice if there's a problem with your compliance. So it's good to have somebody on and close by to help you get compliant, but getting overly concerned, as long as you're making an effort, being too worried, losing sleep over it is not necessary. I'll be doing many more videos discussing all of the aspects of the California Consumer Privacy Act. And they're going to be intended as an answer to questions. Most of them will be answers to actual questions that my clients ask me as I go through. So hopefully they'll be targeted and not overly wordy. If you like what you hear and you want to get more guidance as it comes out, then please hit subscribe, and I'll see you in my next video.